Good afternoon, everybody. Great to have you here. Thank you so much for being with us. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, which includes former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. We're sorry that Congressman Mel Levine's dog is very sick, and he couldn't be with us tonight, and he sends his regrets. Thank you and welcome to our guest, the esteemed Richard Haass, formerly of the Council on Foreign Relations, who will define what success could look like in the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Welcome and thank you also to our moderator, the wonderful Patt Morrison. Sometimes a year's worth of news happens in a few days, to coin a phrase of others in the past, and that defines this week. News is moving at breakneck speed, and this week proves that more than ever before. We are doing our best to keep up. We hope you will look at the articles we usually include in our emails. We try to provide you with the best opinion columns about breaking news events, and usually we can share them without paywalls so that they are accessible even without a subscription. Next week, we have two programs. On Monday, July 22nd, we will have our 15th Israel and Crisis program featuring Aaron David Miller, who spent 25 years at the State Department focused on Middle East and is now a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a global affairs analyst for CNN. And then Wednesday, July 24th, we will welcome Congressman Adam Schiff, who was all over the news today, having to do with issues of grave importance to the country and to the Democratic Party. He will give us his perspective from the Hill during these very tumultuous times. So buckle up for next week's program. In the following weeks, we'll have Bill Kristol, Dahlia Lithwick, Mike Mullen, Rick Hassett, Nick Kristof, Adam Kinzinger, and many other very important voices informing us about events in our country and beyond. At the bottom of each email that I send is a list of the next 5 or 6 programs with registration links. Judge is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. I want to alert you that under the activism tab on our website, we have all kinds of nonpartisan organizations which we have vetted, which have lots of volunteer opportunities, mostly related to voter protection, voting rights, and voter registration. If you want to get involved, go to our website and find one of the many organizations which suits you best. It's really important this year to work on those issues. Reminder, all of our programs are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel and our website, and links for all those access points are in every email we send. You can go to our website and find links to everything as well, JewsUnitedForDemocracy.org. We encourage you to send our links and our emails to your friends, especially as the November election nears. Now to introduce tonight's guest and moderator. Richard Haass is a veteran diplomat and respected scholar of international relations. He is President Emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he served as president for more than 20 years, in fact, until quite recently. Prior to his work at the Council, Dr. Haass served at the Department of Defense, at the Department of State as Special Assistant to President George H.W. Bush, as a Senior Director at the National Security Council, and so much more. As a true mark of honor and distinction, Dr. Haass has advised Republicans and Democrats on various foreign policy issues at the very top levels over the course of many years and continuing to the present. That's truly a mark of distinction. The Senate approved Dr. Haass as a candidate for the position of ambassador, and he has been the United States coordinator for the future of Afghanistan. We are truly fortunate once again to welcome Richard Haass to America at a Crossroads. Our moderator tonight is Patt Morrison. She is a writer and columnist for the Los Angeles Times, where as a member of 2 Los Angeles Times reporting teams, she has the share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. She is a beloved and much sought after host on a variety of public television and radio programs. She's received 6 Emmys and a dozen Golden Mikes. Among her many awards, last year, the Society of Professional Journalists of Greater Los Angeles conferred their prestigious Distinguished Journalism Award on none other than Patt Morrison. I'm very pleased to turn tonight's program over to Patt. Patt?
Janice, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody who is watching and everybody who supports this program, which could not be more vital to what it is going on in the world and in this democracy than it is right now. And Dr. Haass, thank you very much for joining us as well.
Well, thanks so much for having me back.
I want to point out that your new book is called The Bill of Obligations, The 10 Habits of Good Citizens, and I want to get to that later in the program if we can. I also want you who are watching us to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get as many of them to Dr. Haass as possible. We called this session, Dr. Haass, Defining Success, Ukraine and Gaza. In this country, domestic politics has meant we've taken our eye off the ball for a few days. So before we talk about the long-term goal, maybe we can talk about what's been going on in the last few days internally in those countries and where they find themselves situated now.
Okay, let me just start with the idea that it's important to think about what your definition of success is. So I like your title. So often in life and policy, foreign policy, domestic, we don't stop and think about that. Just what are we trying to accomplish? What is it? What would constitute something that we believe is both desirable and possible? And we often don't do that. Sometimes we have goals that may be desirable but not possible, and so forth. So I think it's a really useful, smart way to frame it. In terms of what's going on in Ukraine, look, we're 2 years and do the count since February, March, April, May, 2.5 years roughly now, almost into this phase of the war. And I'd say it's been quite remarkable what's been accomplished by Ukraine. It's just essentially with American and European help fought Russia to a standstill. There's been remarkably little net change in territory over the last 2.5 years. I think when the U.S. aid was cut off earlier this year, things began to tilt somewhat in Russia's direction with the resumption of American military aid. I think we're now beginning to see a leveling out again, where Ukraine seems to have recovered its footing. So my guess is here we are in the middle of the third fighting season of this phase of the war. And I think at the end of this fighting season, towards the end of the year, the battlefield is going to pretty much look like it looks today. More destruction, more death, but not fundamentally changed.
The attack on the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, I think, put people's attention back on the topic, much as the bombing at the hospital in Gaza did.
No, absolutely. It's a reminder that Russia is fighting this war not simply on battlefields against Ukrainian armed forces, but he's fighting it against Ukrainian society. And he's targeting all sorts of economic targets, electricity, as well as humanitarian targets, hospitals, and the rest. War crimes have become commonplace for Russia. What it's designed to do is break the back of Ukraine. It's morale, it's psychological willingness to resist, and it's had some effects, but it's also hardened Ukrainian determination. And it's just a reminder of what Ukraine is up against and why I believe that Ukraine is worthy of our support.
Has there been a sense, maybe in Ukraine, of holding its breath because Britain had its elections, France had its elections with pretty puzzling, sometimes chaotic results, and our election is still coming up? Much of what will happen to and in Ukraine hangs in the balance. Absolutely.
And the two previous elections are not reassuring to Ukraine for one reason. In both cases, in Britain and France, the incumbent lost. We saw that, and in Britain, it meant the center-left government ousted the conservatives. In France, it meant that Macron centrists lost to the far left and also to the right. And so if an anti-incumbent mood dominates in this country, that means Joe Biden or whoever the Democratic candidate is will lose, and Donald Trump will be the next president. And he and his vice presidential choice have made clear their lack of enthusiasm, shall we say delicately, for continued American support for Ukraine militarily. So yeah, if you're in Ukraine, you don't really have an alternative. That's what we saw in those few months where the U.S. aid was cut off by the House of Representatives, by Republicans there. So I think that people are waiting with bated breath and real anxiety. And the question would then be, if that were to happen, how do they need to adjust their military strategy? How do they need to adjust their diplomatic strategy to take it into account?
Our listeners, our viewers are putting their questions in here for us, and we're going to be presenting more later in the program. But apropos of what you just said, EA followed up with that idea, and just didn't call it lack of interest, especially on Vance's part, the new vice presidential nominee, but an actual antipathy toward Ukraine. It seems like here's poor Zelensky trying to walk himself through a political minefield that could be the making or breaking of his country's campaign.
Look, Ukraine is dependent upon American and Western help. The Europeans have only limited ability to provide Ukraine with what it needs militarily. There's not much of a defense manufacturing base there. So Ukraine's ability to hold off Russia would be dramatically diminished if the United States is not willing to continue its support. So it would be potentially dire in its consequences. And again, as I said, Ukraine would have to adjust dramatically in what it did. I think one of the interesting questions, though, is I don't assume that a Trump administration would simply cut off aid. That's possible. But there's also questions about whether they might condition it. Might they say to Ukraine, we'll continue aid to you, but only if you agree to certain things? Or they would tell Russia,
we'd like to ask you a favor, though.
Right? We're going to ask you to compromise some of your goals. Not only the favor thing, but more compromise some of your goals in Ukraine. And it might tell the Russians, we need you to compromise some of yours. I think Mr. Trump would like to be able to end this war. And to me, the question is, what conditions or demands would he make of both Russia and Ukraine? I don't think it would necessarily just be one-sided. And so I think it's too soon to sit here and say simply the spigot's going to be turned off and the United States is going to leave Ukraine to its fate. I actually don't think that will happen. I think it'll be more nuanced than that. At least I'm hoping it would be.
Do you read any significance into the visit by Viktor Orban of Hungary to Putin and then to Trump in Mar-a-Lago?
Yeah, I think, again, well, for two ways. One, Viktor Orban has become a kind of model or symbol of a illiberal democracy with a certain bent or leaning towards Putin and authoritarians. And obviously the fact that Mr. Trump had him to Mar-a-Lago just before the Republican convention was no coincidence. Orban is terribly popular with a lot of Trump's base. So I see that. And whether, Orban is actually talking about different plans that could bring an end to the fighting. And the question is the details. Putin recently announced some things about his price, and it would be, I thought it was an exorbitant price. But I think you're going to see, my guess is, come 2025, you are going to see a much more active diplomatic space when it comes to Ukraine. And whether it's some of the ideas floated by Putin or about one of the things I have been urging this administration and others is the United States ought to be floating its ideas. I don't think it's simply good enough to say the only coming back to your title. I don't think the only definition of success for Ukraine can be complete military liberation going back to 1991. It's not in the cards. I'm not saying Ukraine should give up its claims to the territory, but the definition of success cannot be something that I believe is unachievable. So I think it's time to have a much more serious, honest conversation about what's an achievable definition of success for Ukraine.
Well, we'll get back to Ukraine, but you mentioned the definition of success, and virtually since October 7th, the question has been, what is success for Israel in its war with Hamas? Getting rid of Hamas is a goal, but what is that goal? How is it achieved? And how do you know that you've gotten there? Have the goalposts moved and have the tactics changed?
Well, Israel said from from October 8th on that the definition of success was the elimination of Hamas. The problem with that definition of success is it can't be achieved. Israel has seriously degraded Hamas over the last 9+ months. But even if they've killed, according to their own count, between 10 and 15,000 Hamas fighters, that means there's still another 15 or 20,000 Hamas fighters they haven't killed. So the military defeat or elimination of Hamas, I believe, is an unachievable goal. I don't believe once you enter a war with unachievable goals. I think the goal should be the marginalization of Hamas. And that means, yes, militarily degrading them, but it also means coming up with a political alternative, coming up with something Palestinians in Gaza and elsewhere could rally around. And that Israel has refused to do. It's refused to put forward policies that could essentially allow people to coalesce around an alternative. So a one-dimensional military strategy, I believe, cannot achieve success there.
But is there not something useful for certain factions in Israeli military or politics to keep that idea of destroying Hamas always out there, so there's always an opportunity, always a campaign going on to achieve that goal, however close or far away it is?
It's not, there may be, but it's not the way I would put it. I would think the goal ought to be that Hamas is never able to again enter positions of power in Gaza. That ought to be the goal. And that's again as much a political goal as it is anything else. And again, I think that can only be achieved with a comprehensive policy that would not just put military pressure on Hamas, would build up an alternative to it, an alternative that could govern, that could provide economic help, that could rebuild Gaza, and that could provide security. And I think the people of Gaza could get a lot of help from Arab governments, from Palestinians in the West Bank, but Israel has to agree to certain things if that were to happen, has to basically facilitate that. And up to now, it's not. So I think what we're looking at is not what I've just described, but we're probably looking at a low-level conflict with Gaza for some time to come, almost open-ended. Not the intense war we've seen over the past 9 months, but basically a low-level conflict, almost occupation light. Israel will try to find groups it can work with. I don't think it'll find much success in Gaza. I don't think you'll have large external involvement. You'll have a relief effort more than a reconstruction effort. I think essentially you won't have a solution to the situation in Gaza. I think that's where we're heading.
You tweeted the other day that the situation in the Middle East is decidedly unripe for diplomacy, not because Israelis and Palestinians lack the ability to make peace, but because they're unwilling to compromise other goals in order to do so. I don't know what any kind of peace or compromise or any kind of talks would look like if they are like bilateral. I just can't conceive of that happening. How do you conceive them?
Well, I think you have to break it down. In Gaza, we just talked about it. I think there you would have to have some kind of an arrangement where you get an Arab peacekeeping force facilitated by the United States, but that force will only come in if the Israelis lay out some type of a political path or horizon for Palestinians there. People aren't going to rebuild Gaza only to have it destroyed again by bombs. So I think you need and again, you need an approach that would marginalize Hamas and basically have Palestinians coming forward who are offering a different and better future. And I think that's possible, but only in conditions of security and stability. I think on the West Bank, what's so worrisome there is we're beginning to see the Gazification, to coin a word, of the West Bank. We're seeing more armed struggle, and we're seeing groups beginning to pop up all over the place that are Hamas-like. Much more radical. Younger people in particular have rejected the Palestinian Authority as feckless. And so I worry, in order for negotiations to happen, we have to change the momentum. And that would mean giving people a reason to believe in a moderate alternative. It doesn't mean going to a two-state solution tomorrow. What you want to do is stop things that preclude it. You want to stop settlement activity that gets in the way of it. You want to clamp down on violence. You want the settler violence, but also Palestinian violence. You want to enhance, you want to reform and build the capability of the Palestinian Authority. But before you negotiate, you've got to pre-negotiate. You've got to put in place the things you need in order to have something to work with. So we can't go straight to ambitious diplomacy. But what we've got to do is put into place some of the prerequisites. The problem is none of those are being put into place. And so situations can get worse.
It sounds like the same level of difficulty as the old Vietnam peace talks, where there were weeks and weeks and weeks spent arguing over the shape of the conference table.
Well, actually not. I think in the Vietnam peace talks, there was a certain readiness to make peace. People were obviously interested in the details, wanted to get advantage and so forth. And for the North Vietnamese, peace was less an end in itself than a means to an end. I think in the Middle East, we're not even close to that. At the moment, I just don't see diplomacy's taken a distant back seat. And you've got, again, you don't have leadership on either side that is both willing and able to contemplate making meaningful compromises for peace. It's just missing.
What is the political dynamic in Israel right now? You've had immense turnouts of people in the streets over the fact that the hostages are still hostages, and that, as you say, that the war goes on without much tipping one way or the other.
You're right. I think the Israeli government has clearly made a priority over prosecuting the war, over getting the hostages back. Now, at some point that could change because there's not much left to do to prosecute the war. There's no longer large military targets. I think it's possible you could get not a complete, total, open-ended ceasefire, because Israel will never give up the right to go after Hamas leaders if they get intelligence about them that they could be targeted. But I could see an end to major military operations and so forth. I can imagine something like that if Hamas were willing to agree to it. But again, I think the politics in Israel are pretty clear. Bibi Netanyahu is much more staying power than his detractors would like. There haven't been any investigations of what happened on October 7th. His coalition is hung together. It's got by Israeli standards, a fairly strong majority. He's governing without a formal war cabinet. Hasn't really made much of a difference. There's forces in Israeli society that are, major differences about whether the ultra-Orthodox should serve in the military. We saw the protests before October 7th about the role of the court and so forth. But so far, at least, none of these has come together in a way that could shake the parliamentary coalition. So I don't assume that anything is imminent. I could be wrong, but I don't assume that anything is imminent. And I'd say one other thing. If one looks at Israel demographically and politically, the general shift in Israel, even before October 7th, was to the right. People somehow assume that if only you could get rid of Bibi Netanyahu, you would have this center-left government, a Shimon Peres-like figure or whatever would rule. Not necessarily. Israel is a far more rightist country than it used to be, given in part October 7th, but also given the demographic changes of who's emigrated and who's immigrated, natural increase in families and so forth. Israel is a far more conservative society than it used to be.
How about the U.S. posture toward what's going on with Israel and Hamas? Obviously, there were the protests over the destruction in Gaza and the collateral damage, to use that phrase from the Vietnam era, about innocent victims, civilian victims, children victims as well, which I think did exert an influence for a while on U.S. policy.
Look, U.S. policy now for 9+ months has essentially been initially very supportive of Israel and strategically still supportive of Israel, but disagrees tactically with much of what Israel's done. And what the United States has tried to do is persuade Israel to carry out a different policy, whether it's a policy towards prosecuting the war or hostages or settlements or what have you. And we failed in virtually every turn. And what I would say is we need a much more independent policy. Instead of basing what we do on trying to persuade Israel to act differently, we should just do it. We should have our own policy of what we introduce in the UN. If we don't like Israeli settlement activity, we ought to sanction it if need be. If we don't think Israel is putting forward useful ideas, or the Palestinians aren't putting forward useful ideas about the next phase of Gaza or the West Bank, well, let's put them forward ourselves. Let's come up with an American peace plan. Why don't we do more to strengthen potentially the Palestinian Authority, and to reform it? So I think what essentially we need to do is have a U.S. policy towards this rather than a U.S. working through Israel policy, because I don't think in this Israeli government we really have a partner.
How much of U.S. policy toward Israel would change? How significantly, if there were to be a second Trump administration?
Well, I mean, the rhetoric would change. I'm not sure the actual day-to-day would change, because the Biden administration's been remarkably supportive, other than holding up the delivery of a small number of 500 and 2,000-pound bombs. Israel's gotten everything that it has asked, essentially. So the rhetoric under a Trump administration might be more supportive, but we've been remarkably supportive of Israel. Could there be, greater the willingness to look the other way at settlement activity or annexation? Maybe. It might even be, if you will, more unconditionally supportive of this Israeli government or a government like it. That's possible.
Arnold wants to know whether the countries in the region can make sure that Hamas will no longer gain power in Gaza. I think it's in the interest of a couple of those countries that not happen.
Absolutely. There's no love in most Arab countries for Hamas. It's seen as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and many of these countries have dealt with that on their own. So I don't think, though, they can prevent it. That's, in a sense, it's a battle for the hearts and minds of the people of Gaza. So they can help. And one thing they could do is provide a peace, a stabilization force is what I would call it, in Gaza. That would go there and maintain order against Hamas or anyone else who would threaten it, while ultimately Gaza was rebuilt. But I believe they'll only do that in a setting where there's not an active war, and where Israel is willing to politically make some compromises, so they have something to work with to basically persuade the people of Gaza that there's a political alternative to Hamas. So I think, but that would be a major thing, would be to get Arab, Egyptian, others, Saudi, conceivably UAE participation in a Gaza stabilization force. But it would be a demanding situation. As we said before, there's probably still 10, 15,000 or so Hamas fighters. So a stabilization force would not be a peacekeeping force initially. It would have to deal with a quite demanding environment. And I believe it's conceivable our countries would agree to that, but only if certain political requirements were met. It couldn't be an open-ended military mission. They would have to believe that there was a political dynamic that meant this could end and succeed.
It sounds like there's not much of a likelihood of that at this point.
I think that's a fair conclusion, Pat.
Yeah. What about the role of Iran? The United States has reiterated its concerns that Iran is in the process of inching closer and closer to a nuclear weapon, which it might not be at all loath to use, and its willingness to interfere in matters in the Mideast and destabilize the situation.
Look, Iran has inched closer. It's built up the amount of enriched uranium it has. It's raised the level of enrichment. It hasn't crossed certain lines, as best we know. People haven't been focusing on that. We've been focusing on the groups Iran supports: Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. That's where most of the attention has gone. But you're right, that other issue is real. It could trigger military action by Israel, or conceivably the United States. One interesting twist in this: you've got a new president of Iran who talks about improving the economic situation. What the principal way to improve, one of the principal ways to improve the economic situation is to reduce sanctions. Well, that would mean maybe cooperating more on the nuclear front. It's not clear whether he will be in a position to influence the nuclear program. That's up to the Supreme Leader, the IRGC, and others. So it's an interesting space to watch, which is, given some of the political changes going on in Iran, where do they go with their nuclear program? Because Iran has a lot of things going on right now, given Hezbollah, given the Houthis, given Gaza. And the one question is, do they want to provoke a crisis right now? Maybe, but maybe not. So it's just an interesting space to watch, given that there's a lot of moving parts right now.
And you wonder what the tipping point is internally in Iran, with young, educated people demanding.
I don't think there is a tipping point anytime soon. Sorry. I think that even if a majority of Iranians would like to see significant change in terms of the society and the rest, I think it's wishful thinking. I'm sorry. I'd love to be wrong. Good news is I'm wrong a lot. But I think it's wishful thinking to think to predict that anytime soon there will be a tipping point and the revolution of '79 will disappear. I think they've got a lot of levers of power. They're willing to use force. They're producing over 3 million barrels of oil a day, exporting a lot of it, among others, to China. I think this regime is under some pressure, but it's not on the ropes. And so we can't base our policy on the hope that there is another revolution. I'd love to see it, but I don't see it happening.
Let's take another question about the Mideast before we move back to these shores. Abigail, one of our viewers, says, what is the likelihood of an all-out war between Israel and Hezbollah? Can you predict the U.S. stance, since Iran might become involved in that?
It's a good question. I think the current situation is untenable, where you have upwards of 75,000 Israelis who have had to evacuate their homes in northern Israel. I don't think any Israeli government could live with that in an open-ended way. So, whether though that will necessarily lead to war, it could also be worked out diplomatically. And diplomatically doesn't mean a formal agreement. There could be an informal arrangement between Israel and Hezbollah. They know how to talk to one another. Israel and Iran know how to talk to one another. So I'm still hopeful that there will be more of a diplomatic than a military response here, because neither Israel nor Hezbollah, I would argue, want an active front. So I haven't given up hope. I don't think it's inevitable that it's possible, absolutely, but I don't think it's inevitable. What the United States would do, look, I think we would be mostly supportive of Israel in such a situation, particularly because if you had a situation where Hezbollah was attacking Israeli cities, I think the United States would, be behind the ceasefire with everything we could, but would also be supportive of Israel.
Let's go to a question from many people asking you to analyze the scenario of a second Trump administration versus a second Biden administration, how it would affect Ukraine, Gaza, NATO, and generally world stability. We're looking at Korea, we're looking at China, and even relationships with Modi in India, I'm sure.
It's a very simple, quick question to answer. It's basically it's the kitchen sink question. So it involves a lot. Look, let me start with this. The Biden administration's relatively easy. It's easier to answer because it would be more continuity than anything else. You've had 4 years of Biden. You had the previously 8 years of Obama, interrupted by the 4 years of Trump. So I'd assume a second Biden term, the outlines would be pretty recognizable. Probably a lot of the people would be recognizable. So you'd have continued support for Ukraine. The challenge would be to make sure you had congressional willingness to fund it. The question mark wouldn't be the Biden administration, it would be the Congress. So the race, who controls the House and the Senate, could be critical at that point. I think you'd have continued support for Taiwan. Pretty tough economic policy towards China, but also geopolitically supportive of Taiwan. I think no matter who wins, there'll be a desire to have closer relations with India. This has been a bipartisan phenomenon that's going on for several decades now. So I don't see that fundamentally changed. I also don't see it fundamentally going that far. India is not poised to become an American ally. I think there's a bit of exaggeration about what to expect from the U.S.-Indian relationship. Funnily enough, you could have a little bit more trade frictions talked about under a Trump administration. We've already talked about the Middle East. I think the bigger questions, Pat, are what would happen in the Trump administration, because there you don't have the presumption of continuity. You have the first 4 years of Trump to go by, but that's now 4 years ago. He's changed. The world has changed. He'd have a different cast of people with him, so it's harder to speculate. But by everything that's said, you'd have to assume a desire to dial down U.S. support for Ukraine. What I don't know, and as we discussed, whether you'd have some type of a dramatic peace initiative where we would condition U.S. aid to Ukraine only if they agreed to certain borders or what have you, or whether we
territorial concessions.
Yeah, but maybe not. What I would say is what I've argued is a willingness to accept an interim ceasefire without making it permanent. I don't think we should ever ask Ukraine to give up its claims, but we could ask them to accept something like the current borders. Mr. Trump might be willing to say that he would never support NATO bringing in Ukraine, which is something that Mr. Putin wants. The question is whether we put pressure on Russia. What about pushing back about what it would have the right to demand, and whether if Russia didn't agree with us, whether we would then say, well, if you're not going to agree, we're going to support Ukraine. I don't know the answer to that. My crystal ball is a bit cloudy there. But I think that would be I think 2025 is going to get very interesting on that. Talked about the Middle East in terms of Mr. Trump's interview with Bloomberg, was it yesterday, the day before, indicates, I think, real skepticism about American support for Taiwan. But there's a big debate going on in Republican foreign policy circles. There are those Republicans who mainly see China in economic terms, and I think Mr. Trump is one of them, who want to be much more confrontational with China economically, even though Mr. Biden's been pretty confrontational himself there. And there's those Republicans who also want to be more confrontational with China geopolitically. There's still the third batch of Republicans who want to call for regime change in China. So I think there's going to be a bit of a struggle for Mr. Trump's mind when it comes to China policy. So it's a little bit hard for me to sit here with confidence and say exactly how it's going to play out.
I think we heard from Donald Trump some of the same arguments he used about NATO. Well, if you're not paying your bills, we're not going to help you. But the larger scenario is that stable democracies with stable institutions encourage growth, encourage business, and encourage a flourishing world economy.
I tend to agree with that, but I don't think that that argument counts for a lot with Donald Trump. I think when he looks at other countries, he looks not at the fact whether they're democracy. I think he looks a lot at trade balances and whether he sees them as trade competitors, whether he sees them as abusing access to the American market, denying us fair access to their market. I think his metric is much more of a trade and economic one than it is anything else.
Does that deprive the U.S. of some larger leverage if this is simply a transactional dollar arrangement with the rest of the world, and that they can't trust the United States word any longer, and that the way we talk about Britain as little England, little Britain retreating from engagement internationally, will we become little America?
I think the devil will be in the details. I would say all things being equal, we will become less of a presence in the world if there's a Trump president. Perhaps decidedly less. I think you will get a narrower view of what is essential in the world. You'll have a slight anti-interventionist or more than slight anti-interventionist bias. There won't be an instinctive support for democracies, will not be an instinctive support for allies, raise the salience of economic issues, particularly trade. So yes, I think you will have a significant dialing down of America's involvement in the world. I think most of the Trump people believe that we have overextended, that we have overreached in the world, that it's simply not worth it, that a lot of what we're doing is simply wasteful or misguided, and that we ought to refocus our energies here at home. I think that is the prevailing mindset of a lot of people in the Trump administration. Real skepticism about the value of the kind of foreign policy we've carried out over 75 years. And by the way, just to say, we've given that argument some ammunition with things like the Iraq War in 2003, Vietnam, and so forth. We have overreached at various times. And when we do things that are by definition, I would say, overreach, we set the stage then for a reaction of underreach. And I think that's where we are.
And indeed, we've acknowledged that you mentioned Iraq and Vietnam specifically, that some of those were fueled by false scenarios, no WMDs, the Tonkin Gulf incident, things like that, rather than in hindsight now, what was a legitimate triggering event.
Well, my hunch is we probably would have fought both without those triggering events. They were triggering events. It's like things happen without triggering events. They'll just find other triggering events if things are aligned. And that's probably true of World War I, even without the assassination of the Archduke. I think it would have happened in Vietnam because of our thinking about communism, or it had to be resisted even without Tonkin Gulf. I think my own view, and I was in the administration of George W. Bush, I was opposed to going to war against Iraq, but in my view is we would have gone even without the weapons of mass destruction argument. I think there were other motivations for going to war.
There's a pretty dark question from Mark, one of our viewers. He says, if Trump and Vance take office in January, could we face a collapse of the world order reminiscent of the 1930s?
Again, as Yogi Berra once said, predictions are tough, particularly about the future. I think that's probably too binary or it's thinking too much of a switch. I think what more likely, probably a better metaphor might be erosion, something a little bit more gradual. It's not all or nothing. It might be more of an erosion in some geographies than others. We'll have to see how then other governments adapt to our doing less. So I think collapse is probably the wrong image. It's too sudden, it's too dramatic, it's too all or nothing. But we could see a real diminution or erosion of order. I think that's probably more realistic.
Victor wonders whether you know a lot about what was accomplished at the recent NATO summit. Was it short-term philosophizing or long-term prevention and scenarios of prevention?
If I were cynical, I would say I know more about wasn't accomplished at the recent NATO summit. I don't think it accomplished a whole lot, and it couldn't. It came in on the heels of the French vote. So real uncertainty about what France's foreign policy would be. And then it's all done against the uncertainty here. And what we've just been talking about, what would a Trump policy be towards Ukraine, towards NATO, towards Europe, and so forth. So people can talk all they want in communiques about saying, giving Ukraine a quote unquote irreversible path to membership, but that's not worth the paper it's written on. And so I thought the NATO summit had a lot of nice words that it sounded better than it was. It's almost a take on Wagner's music. It's not as bad as it sounds. The NATO summit wasn't as good as it sounds. And we'll see if a lot of those pledges ever come to fruition. But I thought it was an awkwardly timed event, no way around it. But given all the elections going on and so forth, there was nothing much that could be agreed on there that would matter beyond the next few months.
With so much in flux, Philip and Armand have a question. If Ukraine continues to strike deeper into Russia itself, then what are the odds of Putin using battlefield nukes? What would NATO's response be should the US allow Ukraine to use weapons deeper in Russia? Although I think President Biden just spoke of, gee, what would happen if they end up striking Moscow?
Yeah, we're not going to let that. So yeah, I think it's a legitimate debate what weapons we provide and what constraints we put on those weapons. And the critics of the administration have said our restraints have been too great. We've been too slow to supply certain weapons, and the constraints we put on their use has been geographically too severe. That's a legitimate debate. I myself would be open to giving Ukraine a bit more of a free hand. I think it's important that Mr. Putin feel the pain of this war. I think that would actually move him closer to the negotiating table. Two things will get him to the negotiating table, I believe, on terms we would like to see. One is stalwart American support for Ukraine. The other is a bit greater freedom for Ukraine to inflict pain on Russia, but it ought not to be unlimited. We do not want targeting of civilian sites we don't want the major cities. Again, we're not looking for an all-out war here between Russia and Ukraine or between the United States or NATO and Russia. So this is, look, foreign policy is hard, and how to thread that needle, how to give Ukraine enough support and enough freedom, but not too much. That's a needle thread. And, I think we've got it more right than not, but that's a legitimate question going forward. Could Putin at some point be thinking of nukes? Yeah, possibly. His conventional arms, excuse me, the performance of his conventional forces, his non-nuclear forces have obviously been disappointing. I think, though, he'd only think about nuclear in extremis if Russian forces in Ukraine and Crimea or the East were getting routed. I think then he might think about it. I don't think that's likely, but I think that would be the scenario where it might come to the fore, and we'd have to think about how we try to manage that situation.
Does all of this in flux, the fact that we're talking about normalizing battlefield nukes or the tactics that Israel is using in Gaza to go after Hamas and the cost that it's wreaking on the rest of the population, are we at a point where we're shedding this post-World War order completely and normalizing, redefining, without knowing yet what it is, what the world will look like for the rest of this century?
A bit too negative, and I'm usually the most negative person in the room, so I want to protest.
Okay, my turn.
It's a bit too negative. But no, look, the post-World War II order was built on certain principles, one of which is the non-acquisition of territory by force. It's interesting, the first challenge of the post-Cold War period was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which brought that principle to the fore, and the world rallied behind it. We had this enormous coalition, more UN resolutions than we could count. We had China or Soviet Union at the time on board, and so all the Arabs pretty much were on board. We have nothing like that today. So what we're seeing is a world that's far less unified, far less on the same page about what ought to be the principles of this world order. We have truly disaffected countries like Russia, North Korea, Iran. China's a slightly more complicated case. We're seeing more examples of both intra as well as inter-state war. So yeah, what we're seeing is the deterioration of that of the post-war order, but it's not its collapse, it's not its end. But that's I wrote a book years ago called "The World in Disarray," and I saw that already happening a decade ago, and it's continuing. One of the reasons I worry about the U.S. doing a lot less in the world is I think that would accelerate this trend.
Of the American retreat from engagement, you mean?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. There are other factors which were not present then, including climate change, water crises, environmental crises,
Yep.
which seem in many cases to be beyond the scope or even interest of some governments. Is this X the unknown in all of this?
No, I should have mentioned it. You're right to mention it. It's another one of the, what word you want to use, axes, and one of the things that makes me nervous. If you got, the revival of geopolitics, you've got strong states, you got weak states, you got questions about the United States. You've also got this enormous gap that's opened up between global challenges and global responses. Climate's probably the most pronounced now. It's still possible before this century's run its course that climate could be the defining challenge. I'm not a pessimist, though. I actually have zero confidence about the utility of these annual gatherings, these COP meetings, these conference of parties meetings. I think they are essentially a waste of money and time. But I do have tremendous confidence in technology. And I do think that if there's a hope in the climate struggle, it'll be what technology can deliver. It's interesting, technology got us through the last great global challenge, which was COVID. Two things, mRNA vaccines and Zoom. The vaccines came on board in less than a year rather than 10 years. Zoom meant none of us had to make a fateful choice about whether to go to work or stay at home or what have you. I think technology will probably one day get us through climate, whether it's alternatives or carbon capture or sprinkling reflective particles in the atmosphere, batteries, nuclear, some combination of all the above, hydrogen, I don't know. But I think our priority there, because we're clearly not doing the restraint, the mitigation, we're still burning way too much coal and so forth. I would say that we ought to really double down on our investment in technological breakthroughs that could help us on climate.
Your latest book, you mentioned an earlier one, is the Bill of Obligations, the 10 Habits of Good Citizens. And a lot of people, I think for maybe too long, certainly since the end of the Second World War, have in some cases looked upon this country more as an ATM machine. It's about what it puts out for you rather than anything going back in. The John F. Kennedy.
Can I steal that from you?
Of course, with full credit. But to what extent, obviously, I think the last rounds of elections have aroused a lot of interest and almost an awakening in American voters on both sides.
Yeah.
But what is your argument in this book about the habits of good citizens, whether it's making sure that, you put your trash in the trash bin, something as minor as that, up to what? What are the steps? What's the scale of this?
Look, where you began is where I began, that rights are central to a democracy, but a democracy cannot succeed if there's only rights. There's got to be obligations. That's the other side of the coin. It's obligations of each of us to one another in the society, and obligations of each of us to the country and to the government. I came up with my list of 10 obligations. One became rather salient over the last week: to no political violence. We have to learn to settle our differences through debate, through voting, can't be through bullets. I talked about the importance of being informed and being involved. We're going to have a chance to get informed and get involved between now and November. I think that's essential. I talk a lot about behaviors, about respecting norms, about civility and all that. Those have to be modeled, they have to be taught, they have to be preached. I have two specific policy proposals. One is to make civics education a staple of every high school and college student's life. I really don't think you should be able to graduate without it. We wouldn't think of graduating someone who couldn't read or write or think critically. Why do we think it's okay they can graduate without being prepared to be citizens, to knowing something of this precious inheritance called democracy, what it gives to them, but also what it requires from them, some basics of their history, maybe how to navigate this information space we live in, so they can be informed citizens. So I think that ought to be a staple of a high school and college education. I also think we ought to, you mentioned JFK, public service ought to come back. We ought to have far more
The
opportunity.
draft?
I don't think we ought to make it mandatory. I like the idea of universal participation. I don't think Americans would take well to something that's mandatory. But I think if we could incentivize it, which would be the way for example, we give all sorts of benefits and incentives for veterans who join the military, for people who join the military for afterwards. Well, let's do it for public service across the board. Employers could do it, schools could do it, and so forth. Some states are doing it. California has been the leader in it under this governor, under Josh
Gavin
Friday.
Newsom?
Under Gavin Newsom, under Josh Friday, who's the commissioner who oversees volunteerism and all that in California. So that's, they've stood up some programs. One of them, the Climate Corps, has the White House then basically said that's our model for what we want to do nationally, which I think is great. So I think we ought to have more public service, much more civics. And then a lot of it's just accountability. I always say, I want politicians, people who put the country before party or person. Well, that's up to us. When we go and vote, we've got to demand that. And we've got to say, we're going to vote for you, but we're not going to vote for you because you are willing to put the country before your party or your own ambitions, but we're not going to vote for you because you're not. But that's on us. And I don't think American democracy gets saved by an individual from above. It gets saved by a lot of people from below.
Those people are interested in that model, in the country over party.
Well, again, we have to, and we have to, I think, make the case for this democracy. I think one of the real costs of assuming we didn't have to do it is we've learned that people don't understand why democracy is valuable and what it takes. I think the falling off of civics education is a massive mistake in this country. It's coming back a little bit. I acknowledge that, but a lot of it's wildly uneven. We need national standards. We don't need a national curricula, granted, but we do need national standards. And I would like to see it be a stable. I think we pay a price for not having more Americans see the value in democracy. And when they get frustrated because they see people in Washington not doing things, well, then that ought to incentivize them to get different people in Washington who will work together.
And to understand the mechanics of democracy as well.
100%. 100% the mechanics. Yes, and that's the only way to be an astute observer, an informed observer, and the only way to get involved, if you understand what are the entry points.
Because it seems like the erosion of civics, that you pointed out the price that we're paying, and that bringing it back also provides a kind of inoculation against the misinformation that has been running rampant and undercutting people's ability even to understand how to function as a democracy.
Yeah, that's why information literacy has to be a staple of civics. In East Coast, in New Jersey, there's courses, I think, now being offered in high schools about information literacy. Countries in Europe do it. But how do you navigate the internet? What is a fact? How do you fact check? What is good information hygiene? Getting multiple sources. What's an authoritative source? And so forth. I think we've got to teach that. We've got to teach people to be more informed consumers of information, so they will also be able to reject misinformation.
We see a lot of pessimism out there, judging by some of the questions in the box here about Project 2025, dismantling the education department, chopping block, cutting back, replacing civil servants with political appointees, which we saw happen in the 19th century in some administrations disastrously. And people are not just pulling out their hair, they're setting it on fire.
Look, there's reasons to be concerned. This is an election with stakes and with consequences. Even before you get to the project, whatever it's called, 2025, every president gets the ability to appoint the top 4,000 people in the government. cabinet, sub-cabinet, sub-sub-cabinet. So presidents have enormous power. Ultimately, personnel is policy. Then this is on top of it. If you have a move afoot to weaken the independence and the expertise and excellence of the civil service, that's a real cost. You're right. One of the early 20th century reforms was to professionalize the civil service, to do away with the spoil system. We knew governments become more important, so we needed competent people in government. I'm not an expert on all the things government has to be an expert about. You don't want me making healthcare policy. Trust me. But we want people who are experts in there. So an anti-expertise movement where political litmus tests are introduced instead seems to me that's the road to ruin. It's one of the reasons that, again, that's people should get informed and people should vote.
Of course, the riposte to that, as we're just seeing, is the Chevron decision by the Supreme Court to kind of hobble expertise. But Dr. Haass,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
You have a couple of minutes, and we try to end on an upbeat note, particularly necessary in these times. So if you could muster a couple of optimistic minutes for us, I think everybody would be very grateful.
Well, as you can tell, it's slightly off-brand for me to go wildly optimistic. But I mentioned one area. I actually think technology. It did get us through COVID relatively intact, much better than otherwise. And I do think it has the potential to get us through climate. So we ought to be investing there. I think Ukraine's a reason for optimism, how the world has rallied around it, how Russia has been frustrated. 2.5 years ago, if we'd been having this conversation, we would not have predicted this outcome. This has been a remarkable achievement. The strength of the American alliance system. We have dozens and dozens of willing and able partners around the world who are willing to work with us, whether it's on regional challenges, global challenges. How many partners and allies does Russia or China have? Not too many. The last I checked, we have an incredibly robust economy in this country that's creating enormous number of jobs. It's the most innovative economy in the world. So I think we have lots of things going for us. We're producing a lot of energy. People still line up around the world to go to our universities, though in some cases I may wonder why. But that's a conversation for another day. So I think there's lots of reasons for optimism, and more important, even if you disagree with me, there's no space for defeatism. Pessimism is one thing, but pessimism ought to be a motive. Pessimism ought to pick up people off their butts to get involved, to make things better, or to avert bad things. But no one should be either sanguine, assuming that good things will just happen. But also on the other side, no one should be defeatist to assume that good things cannot happen. It's important that people get involved. Ultimately, we'll get as I say, we get the government we deserve. We may not get the government we need. That's up to us. So, but I think there's reasons for optimism. But to be optimistic means to get involved. Doesn't mean to be sanguine. We can't assume
complacency.
Complacency is dangerous. A good way to put it.
Richard Haass, your new book is The Bill of Obligations. You're under no obligation to return, but we hope that you will.
Thank you. If people want to read about me before then, I put out a weekly newsletter, Pat, called Home and Away on Substack. And if they decide they want to see what I have to say about domestic or foreign challenges, they can do it every Friday on Substack.
Thank you so much for that, and for your hour of insights here. Most welcome. Thanks again.
Thank you for doing this, by the way.
We want to be sure that you are here with us next week for 2 programs, as you see coming up there, and joining us with Congressman Adam Schiff, who today said he thinks it's time for Joe Biden to step down from his candidacy for another term. But all sorts of topics coming up in the future. You can see them there, and you can also see how you can support these programs. Thank you for watching this evening.